I'm really looking forward to the end of Judges, specifically because I am excited to see how you say anything meaningful about these final chapters. These are tough chapters in the book of Judges. And so I hope that we find ourselves able to hear God in them in some meaningful way. So let me start by saying something somewhat unrelated, or it will seem unrelated, but I've been working on a new set of skills. Some of you know that Tom Bashada has a pretty great wood shop in his backyard. And so a few months ago, I asked Tom if he'd teach me some stuff about working with wood. And I won't bore you with all the details about just how good I am getting at woodworking. Just kidding, I'm not. I'm barely not cutting off my fingers. So, but we had this hilarious moment last week. I had just finished cutting a mortise into this piece of wood that we were going to be using, and it turns out that I now know what a mortise is. A mortise is a hole in a piece of wood that allows you to insert a corresponding piece that locks two pieces of wood together. So I had just cut my first mortise, and inside the edges and along the bottom of this hole, there were these loose wood shavings that were sort of loosely attached to the sides and the bottom. And I asked Tom if I should go grab a screwdriver to scrape them out. And like the wise Mr. Miyagi of woodworking that he is, he asked me, "What's a screwdriver used for?" And I stared at him, having no idea what he's asking, because I could literally think of a dozen things you could do with a screwdriver. Because I have used a screwdriver to fix all sorts of problems. Tom asked me again, "What is a screwdriver used for?" And it hit me. To screw in a screw? Exactly, Tom said, as he handed me a small chisel, an appropriate tool for shaving loose chips from a piece of wood. One of the hardest parts about learning a new skill is learning how to properly use the equipment. What makes the tools of woodworking so hard to learn is that I have used many of the tools before, but in inappropriate, unsafe, or just unwise ways. In fact, as a kid, on the very first day of owning my very first toolbox, I attempted to pull out a screw with the claw of a hammer. True story. I broke the head off my very first hammer trying to pull out that screw. A huge part of learning to use the tools well is first unlearning what I think I know about the tools. So, what in the world does this have to do with our passage this morning? Pretty much everything. Because earlier, Don introduced us to our passage, and he introduced us to the central figure in the story, Micah. Micah had been cursed by his mom, thanks mom, but for stealing silver from her. That is until he returned it, and now she blessed him instead. Relieved to have her silver back, Micah's mother dedicated the silver to the Lord by turning some of it into a carved metal image. Micah then took the image and he put it in a special sacred place, a shrine in his home. But he also made additional divine images to set in that same sacred space with the image dedicated to the Lord. Then he ordained his son to serve as his own personal priest. Micah made for him then a special vest called an ephod to be worn by his son when he carried out his priestly duties. Sometime later, a Levite was traveling near Micah's home, and knowing that the Levites were chosen by God to be Israel's priests, Micah sees an opportunity to upgrade his personal priest. Making a deal with this Levite, he offers him a home, he offers him an income, and Micah declared, "Now I know that the Lord will do what is good for me, because a Levite has become my priest." Judges has little room for subtlety. right? You don't need to worry about what's going on and wonder whether it's good or right. Judges tells us explicitly. In verse 6, we read, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes." To start with, everyone is using tools. Tools that God has given them, as is right in their own eyes, which means that they are misusing them. Silver is used to break half of the 10 commandments. First, when it's coveted, then when it's stolen, then when Micah uses it to dishonor his mother, then the silver is turned into a carved image, breaking the second commandment, and then dedicated to the Lord, taking the Lord's name in vain. 5 of the 10. But other tools are misused as well. God's blessing and God's curses are used for personal gain. A home, which was supposed to be a sanctuary for the Lord, is turned into a sanctuary for other gods. Through this passage, the language for shrine and home are the same word in Hebrew. And the sacred priesthood that God had given to Israel is used for Micah's personal assurance that the Lord would do good for him. Money, words, a home, the priesthood, these are tools that God has given to his people to help them live out his purposes, do his work, and one by one, each of these tools is used in a way that seems right in the eyes of the beholder. But pushing this a little bit deeper, misusing tools became a way for the people to do something far worse. The people in this passage attempt to use God himself. Micah's mother believes that she can use the Lord's name to control God's blessings and curses. Micah believes that he can get God to do good for him just as long as he sort of gets the right ingredients in his home. Micah and his mother are right that the Lord is a God who loves to bless and who loves to do good for his people. But Micah and his mother are dead wrong. They do not control the Lord. The Lord will not be used by them. It's easy for us to read this passage and look at Micah and his mother and the Levite and shake our heads and say, shame on these guys. They should know better than to use God like this. They should know better than to misuse God's gifts. And it's there in our judgment of these figures that our passage often confronts us, both powerfully and personally, because this morning's passage is actually most provocative, not in what we find in the explicit details, right? Micah and his mother and the Levite doing what is right in their own eyes. This is what fills what's there and present in the text. This morning's passage is most provocative in what we don't find. Or I should say, in who we don't find. Because God is nowhere to be found. God does not act. God does not speak. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And for the most part, Christian readers don't notice that God is missing from the story. We don't notice because we aren't very good at telling the difference between God talk and God's active presence. We didn't have Don read chapter 18 for us, but chapter 18 gives us the rest of the story. And there's this incredible encounter that shows kind of what I mean by this. The tribe of Dan, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Dan has sent spies to go looking for a new inheritance. And you might remember from the very beginning of Judges that Dan was the one of the 12 tribes that was actually pushed back off of the land that they had received from God, that God had given them. And so clearly, Dan has been struggling to be faithful to the Lord, and they are now in an incredibly desperate place. And so they send spies, and these spies sent by Dan, they make their way north, and they find Micah's house sort of perchance, and they encounter Micah's priest, the Levite. Tells the men about the sweet deal that he has. He's been hired as Micah's personal priest. And in light of Dan's struggles, I mean, it doesn't surprise us that Dan's spies don't seem to think that this is weird at all, that a priest would be getting paid to be a personal priest of an individual and a household. In fact, they not only accept that this is a good thing or this makes sense, but they then attempt to use the Levite for their own personal purposes as well. And so they ask the Levite to seek God on their behalf. And in verse 5, we read, chapter 18, verse 5. Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed. They want to know God's will. They're in the middle of a last-ditch effort, a last-ditch attempt to find a home that they can call their own, where they can live securely. And they are looking for answers. And this is where God talk distracts us from the Lord's absence. The spies express a desire to know God's will. They use spiritual language, inquire of God, ask God for us, but God has already given them instruction. God has already told them that if they would trust him, if they would follow him, that there is land right where they currently live that belongs to them, that God will give to them. But more than that, if you want to inquire of the Lord, if you want to ask the Lord something, there's a place where you can get answers. It's the tabernacle. God has given them a way for them to seek him and to find answers to questions like this. The place where God said he would dwell in their midst. That's where you go when you ask these questions. This is where you go and learn specifics regarding God's will. The spies use God talk, making it sound like they care about God's will when they have already been disobedient to specific things that God had already revealed to them. But the God talk's not over, because the priest has an answer for them. Go in shalom, in peace. The journey on which you go is under the watchful eye of the Lord. Again, the spies talk about wanting to know God's will, and the priest offers an answer that sounds like it could be from the Lord. It sounds so spiritual, right? Shalom is the peace that God gives, and the priest's advice to them is to walk in peace. That the eye of the Lord will watch over them. This is some good theology, isn't it? The psalmist asks, where can we go to escape God? Can we hide from the Lord in the highest of heights? Can we hide from the Lord in the deepest pits? Of course not, the psalmist says. This is good theology. The priest speaks a true word about God's watchful presence. However, there's a missing detail that should cause us to question the priest's advice. There's a gap between his theology and his advice. See, the priest never prays. The priest doesn't seek the Lord. The spies come to him and ask him to inquire of the Lord, to seek the Lord, to ask of the Lord, but he doesn't inquire of the Lord. The priest merely answers, but he answers with really convincing God talk. And we love God talk, right? We love when our favorite entertainers and athletes talk about God in their post-game press conferences and their acceptance speeches because we feel like they're one of us. We get inspired when our politicians talk about God on the campaign trail. Yeah, that's our guy. We're glad when someone tells us that God has surely blessed our plans. We love the confirmation. We accept without question when someone says, God is telling me, fill in the blank. And we trust spiritual leaders who tell us God is leading me, God is leading us to, again, fill in the blank. Right? God talk seems so harmless. I mean, these spies will go up and they will find land that looks good to them. And they will return home. What's the harm in offering these 5 guys words of peace on their travels? Words that give these guys some courage on a dangerous journey. But the word of the Lord's peace, with the word of the Lord's peace, these men are going to do more than just travel. These men will return home, and they will rally the tribe of Dan, and they will murder an entire group of people without a commandment from the Lord. They will murder in the name of God. They will murder because they wanted the land. They saw the land, and it looked very good to them. They will murder in the name of the Lord because they misused God's priesthood. They used God's priest, this Levite, on their own terms, treating him like a fortune cookie or a horoscope. They will murder in God's name because they misused God's word. The spies travel up to the land. They return back to the tribe of Dan, their people, and they begin to quote scripture to get the people of Dan to conquer this new land, to rally them up. What do the spies say? Enter in and possess the land, for God has given it into your hands. We've heard God say these exact words. They are quoting God's words, but God spoke these at a different time and for different land. They treat these words as though it gives them universal permission to take any land that they want at any time. Can you see how dangerous God talk can become? The Lord is mentioned throughout our passage, but he is absent. These people do not serve a king. They serve themselves, and they use the name of their king to do it. There's another reason why we don't notice that God is missing from this passage. Just as we misuse talk about God, we have also learned to misuse the Bible. Somewhere, someone told us that the Bible was a tool to make our lives better or more holy. Someone told us that the Bible was something to apply to our lives. And so, like a fool who uses a hammer claw to pull out a screw, to try to pull out a screw, or a fool who wants a screwdriver to shave loose chips from a piece of wood, we read through this passage looking for advice or wisdom or guidance or some sort of how-to, and we're irritated. We're irritated by this passage when all we find is a super weird story about Micah, his mother, his personal priest, and these Danites. Of course, the Bible is not a self-help book. We know that in our gut, but that doesn't stop us from using it that way. But the Bible has two purposes, two primary purposes. The first is that the Bible introduces us to God. This might seem like, duh, this is pretty obvious here, right? Who is God, though? What is God like? What does God do? If we use the Bible in this way, as a tool to discover God, to know God, to learn about God and understand him, we can't help but read this passage and go, where's God? You notice that God is missing when your eye is trained to look for him. But when your eye is trained to look for advice or for easy to apply wisdom, you just get irritated and bored with the Bible because it doesn't offer that. There are large chunks of the Bible that don't offer anything close to that. The second purpose of the Bible is closely connected to the first. If the first is to reveal to us the God who made us, if the Bible introduces us to this God, it also holds up a mirror to us, introducing us to ourselves, to humanity. What are God's deepest hopes for people, for us? How do humans accept or reject God's intentions? What makes us tick? What are we all about? What should we be all about? The Bible gives us insights in these, but it's really important for us to say that the Bible always gives us an understanding of humans in light of who God is. Right? We don't look to the Bible just to find our purpose or to find keys to a better humanity. We look to the Bible to find God. We look to the Bible to understand who God is and his purposes. And in God, we discover our place in what he is doing. This is the tragedy of our passage this morning. People take ideas from God's word and they put them to use, but with no connection to how God intended them, and worse, with no connection to God himself. It would be one thing, right, if they were just simply misusing God's tools, but had a relationship with God, right? At least that way there would be some possibility of correction, of growth. Misusing God's tools is not the unforgivable sin. Praise the Lord, right? Because if we're honest, every single one of us has misused God's tools many times, right? How many of us have realized at some point that we were spending God's resources in selfish, greedy ways? How many of us have realized at some point that we were misusing God's church as though it existed as a social club for our sort of personal validation and enjoyment? How often have we realized that we were using the Bible, right, as a self-help book? How often have we discovered that we were using prayer as a way to get God to fix our problems? How often do we treat worship as something that exists for us? Something that fills us up, as opposed to something that is offered to God. Right? I mean, these are just a few of the tools that God has given us. And these are just some of the ways that the church, we have misused his tools at various points, at various times. But like I said, misusing God's tools is to be expected, right? There's a degree to which Tom expects me to misuse some of the tools. He's for woodworking. He's trying to make sure that I don't misuse any of them badly enough that somebody ends up with permanent injury. But there's a sense, right, that, and as parents, we know that our kids are going to misuse the things that we give them, and we have a hope and intention to guard against sort of such bad misuse that they hurt themselves permanently. We expect, because we're humans that are growing, we are a work in progress, that we are going to misuse God's tools. The question isn't, are you misusing God's tools? It is better to ask, are we asking God to help us use his tools in more faithful ways? Which actually leads us to the most foundational question I think we can ask. Is there a king in God's church? Is there a king in God's church? Of course, this question doesn't mean, does a king exist in God's church? God was still Israel's king, even when there was no king in Israel. There was no king in Israel, not because God had left, that like God had walked off the job or something. There was no king in Israel because the hearts of the people had abandoned God. There was no loyalty. There was no trust. There was no love. And the people of God did not actually seek God, even when this Levite was given the opportunity to seek God on our behalf. I'll just give you an answer. If we have a king, if Jesus is our king, and our hearts and our lives belong to him, then we will be open and responsive when our king corrects us. We will be open when his spirit urges us to stop misusing the Bible and prayer, his church and worship. And this is where our passage is so profoundly challenging to me. Micah, his mother, the Levite, they have created a system with all of the different components that gives them the illusion that God is with them and that God is blessing them. Right? This system provides them feelings of peace, and it gives them courage. And they have great confidence that God is at work in this system and through the system that they have created, not because of anything that God has said or done, but because of how they feel about it. They've put it in place, and now they feel good. They feel right. They feel confident. This is the most challenging thing for us, because we can worship God in a way designed by us or others that we trust, and it could be deeply authentic. We could really feel that we're doing something, giving God something that honors him. And that act that we call worship can make us feel good and feel blessed and feel inspired, but it's entirely possible. Judges 17 and 18 warn us that God could actually be not honored by our most authentic worship. That God could actually somehow not be active in our worship. And that what we call worship is actually keeping us from the God who wants to be known and loved by us. The systems that we design that use God's name, that use God's tools, but are disconnected from God and his actual instructions for his church, these are the most dangerous because they can blind us to the fact that in the midst of all of our God talk, God is nowhere to be found. And when our system, the system that we've designed with the work of our hands, is threatened, when someone takes from us our experiences, our idols, if we believe that God is in them, we will fight to get them back. One more thing happens in chapter 18. When the spies return to Dan and they head up to conquer the land, they make a quick detour. So, kind of put the story in perspective, the spies have come. They're like, oh, this Levite guy, he's getting paid. This is interesting. Oh, he's giving us some advice. Cool. God's with us. They go up to the land that they're going to conquer. They go, this is amazing. They come back down to the Danites. They go, it's amazing. Come with us. So they all move together. And on their way up, the spies and a few others are like, hey, let's make a quick detour. And they come back to Micah's house. So that's where we're at. When they come back to Micah's house, they have a reason for coming back to Micah's house. It turns out that Micah's religious system was working so well for Micah and his household. The Levite seemed to be enjoying the arrangement. And so the Levite became really attractive to these guys. And so they basically said, why not go and take Micah's system and use it for ourselves? Take everything that Micah has built and we'll use it for our own good. Surely the Lord will be good to us. And so this is where we pick up in verse 20. Chapter 18, verse 20. The priest's heart was glad. This is the Levite. He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people of Dan. They basically just offered to pay him more money. And they said, and prestige. Wouldn't you rather be a priest for a whole tribe than just for a single household? And the priest goes, that does make sense. I will go with you. And so they turned and they departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. When they had gone a good distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out for battle, and they overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, what's the matter with you that you come with such a company against us? And Micah said, you take my gods that I made and the priest, and you go away, and what have I left? How do you then ask me what is the matter with you? Hear the indignant, also desperate cry. And the people said to Dan, and Dan said to him, do not let your voice be heard among us, or else angry men will fall upon you, and you will lose your life and the lives of your household. Then the people of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and he went back to his home. Micah is literally ready to go to war with an entire tribe over worship, over some artifacts for worship. Micah makes his point better than I ever could. The people of Dan have taken my gods that I have made. What have I got left? This is one of the hardest lessons that God's people face. And it's a lesson that's not easily learned. If we associate the Lord's presence with something, right? An artifact, a set of circumstances, or an experience. Something that can be taken away from us. when it is gone, we will feel as though we've been left with nothing, that we cannot experience God's presence again without that thing. If we need something to motivate us to be in relationship with God, something is what gives us confidence that we have a relationship with God. If we need music in our lives, if we need an altar, if we need our favorite pastor or a ministry specifically designed for our interests, if we need a church of a certain size, the list could go on and on and on. If we need a thing other than God's word, God's Spirit, God's Son, and his church. If we need anything to keep us walking faithfully, loving him for his own sake, then that thing is an idol. And if you don't get rid of it, it will be stolen from you, or it will be lost. At some point, you can guarantee it. And like Micah, you will find yourself desperate to retrieve it. If that's the thing you need to have a relationship with God, you will chase after it. You will seek to recover your past. But not just any past, a past that you couldn't even recognize as idolatrous. When Jesus tells the disciples during the Sermon on the Mount that they will say, "Lord, Lord," and they will even prophesy in his name, casting out demons. And Jesus tells them, "I will say to you, I never knew you." He is offering them the same warning that we read in Judges. Don't get so distracted by God talk that you don't actually seek God. Don't assume that because the things you're doing have a loose connection to God's instructions, maybe uses the same language, that you're actually serving God. Instead, follow Jesus. He is our King. The main characteristic of a disciple of Jesus is one who is devoted to the words of Jesus and imitating his life. Follow Jesus. He is our King, and he has shown us how to seek the Father. He has shown us how to serve the Father, and he has shown us how to love him with everything we have. And as we come to the table this morning, we are reminded of the difference between the living God and an idol. An idol can be used. An idol can be manipulated or controlled. An idol is something that you make and that you gain some sort of power over. The living God will never be controlled. In fact, he will demonstrate his great love for us by giving his life for us, giving his Son, so that we might have life. This is incredible, right? An idol can't do anything for you. An idol can't save you. And yet we are so drawn to them. The living God can save you. And he has. He has offered you life and a relationship with him, that you might know his love and walk with him. This is the choice that Moses presents to Israel as they prepare to go into the land. You can choose life or you can choose death. This choice remains for us today as we see Jesus, the most powerful expression of God's love. It shouldn't surprise us that Paul's instructions to many of the churches he wrote included simple statements like, flee from idolatry. You wish he gave us a little bit more detail about what that looked like, but seek Jesus. Devote yourself to his words. Love the Father. This morning, as we come to the table, we are invited to respond anew to him today, to devote our lives, direct our attention, turn our hearts toward him. I invite you, as you come today, to give your heart to the Lord wholly and entirely, and let him direct you.